Hi, I'm Sandy Eberts with the U.S. Geological Survey, and I'm going to talk about a machine learning approach to predict water quality in the glacial aquifer system of the USA. And I just want to start by giving credit to the people who actually did the modeling: Mindy Erickson, Paul Stackelberg, Jeff Starn, and Ken Belitz, all of the USGS. So I'm going to begin by talking about the glacial aquifer system in general, and then the observed water quality at the aquifer scale, moving into machine learning models for arsenic and manganese, as well as why these particular constituents were modeled. Then I turn my attention to some novel predictor variables that were used to explain the arsenic and manganese concentrations, and these predictor variables were extracted from previous machine learning models. Those variables are pH, redox, and some groundwater age metrics, and then I'll summarize. The glacial aquifer system is actually a collection of aquifers that extends under parts of 25 states. It's the largest source of domestic and public drinking water supply in the U.S. To help quantify water quality in the glacial aquifer system, the system was divided into 17 hydrogeologic terrains based on overall thickness of the sediment, predominant texture at land surface, predominant mode of glacial deposition, and age of deposition. Each hydrogeologic terrain was divided into 30 equal areas to provide a spatially unbiased way to assess regional groundwater quality. The data were procured from state and local monitoring programs from the EPA and from USGS databases. The data then were evaluated within each equal area cell within the hydrogeologic terrains to determine the proportion of wells with high, moderate, or low concentrations of a variety of constituents with respect to human health or aesthetic benchmarks. The data then were aggregated at the aquifer scale to determine the aquifer scale proportion of concentrations above a human health or aesthetic benchmark. If we look at these pie charts, we see that trace elements are the only constituents that occurred at high concentrations across a substantial portion of the glacial aquifer system, with arsenic at high concentrations in over 10% of the assessed area and manganese in high concentrations at over 25% of the assessed area. So there was interest in modeling and mapping the probability of high concentrations of arsenic or manganese throughout the glacial aquifer system in 3 dimensions, and a machine learning approach was utilized. And I just want to spend a few minutes talking about some of the aspects of machine learning before we move on to the specific models. In general, machine learning identifies patterns in data and uses those patterns to make decisions and predictions. Machine learning models such as boosted regression trees highlight predictor variables that are most strongly related to a response variable of interest. Tree-based methods work well with large data sets. They don't require assumptions about how data are distributed. They're robust to missing values in the predictor variable data. They handle different types of predictor variables. There's no requirement for independence of predictor variables, and they automatically incorporate complex interactions between predictor variables. So therefore, they're just really well suited for predicting water quality in complex heterogeneous settings like the glacial aquifer system. So the first model we're going to look at is the arsenic model. I'm going to walk you through some of the steps. I won't repeat those every time we look at additional models. The original data set, that's the water quality data, is divided into a training data set used to fit the model and a testing data set used to evaluate the final model. The predictor variables can be varied, and there were more than 100 variables considered. Typical variables are lots of descriptors for aquifer characteristics, precipitation and mountain chemistry as well, soil texture and chemistry, position on the landscape, and then also some novel variables I mentioned earlier on, 3-dimensional information on pH, redox, groundwater age that was generated using previous boosted regression tree models. You can use model results in subsequent models as predictor variables. The relative importance is then provided for each of the predictor variable in the final model. So only a subset of these variables are retained in the final model. Results of the model for arsenic you can see here. This is the predicted probability of arsenic above 10 micrograms per liter at the depth of public supply wells. And I just want to point out these are three-dimensional models, and so you can just slice and dice and present whatever depth you're interested in. And we can see at this depth, the upper Midwest is where you have the highest concentrations of arsenic in the glacial aquifer system. Next, we're going to look at the model for manganese. And I want to point out using this slide that the predicted prevalence of high manganese was just slightly lower than the observed prevalence by about 2.5%. But the predicted prevalence of high arsenic was virtually matched compared to what we saw in the aquifer scale proportion data. About 10% of the aquifer has high arsenic. I also want to point out that over-reliance on predictor variables that represent near-surface conditions can adversely affect the ability to accurately predict subsurface conditions. So historically, it was common to use lots of soils data to serve as proxies for redox and some of the other information that would explain water quality. But if you have three-dimensional information, your model will be much improved. Predictor variables have to be variables that are available across the landscape or throughout the aquifer system to support mapping. So you could include information, say, for tritium at wells where you have response variable data. But if you don't have that data wall to wall, you might have a good boosted regression tree model, but you won't be able to map with it. And so ideally, the final model is a good model, but it depends really only on wall-to-wall information. Here we're going to look at the results of the manganese model at the depth of public supply wells again. And this is predicted probability of manganese above 300 micrograms per liter. And we can see, again, the upper Midwest has the highest concentrations. So now I'm going to turn our attention to some of the models that were used to generate predictor variables. We refer to these as novel predictor variables, but really, redox, pH, groundwater age, these are types of information that explain water quality. What's novel here is generating the information in 3 dimensions so that we can use them in models of water quality, which was already shown. And then I just want to point out with this slide on pH that only sites with well depth are used to develop the models so that they can be attributed with any 3-dimensional estimates of predictor variables that characterize subsurface conditions. For the pH model, 142 potential predictor variables were incorporated in the model, or I guess considered by the model, and they include things like output from existing geospatial data and process-based models and empirical models, and so lots of different types of information like we talked about earlier. The results here are depicted on the right, and what I wanted to point out with the pH work is in the upper figure we see the point location of the sample data. So there's a lot of pH data, but still gaps between it. And then the modeled pH information, you see some of the same spatial patterns, but now it's wall to wall. And while we're on the pH boosted regression tree model, I thought I'd take the opportunity to talk about variable importance. So we have all these predictor variables that we consider in the models, and then some of them are more important than others, and the most important ones are really what form the final model. So for pH, the most important predictor variable was mean concentration of sodium in precipitation. The second most important variable was that classification of the hydrogeology in terms of hydrogeologic terrain. And you might remember that captures differences in parts of the aquifer according to thickness and texture and mode of deposition. So it makes sense that the geology is important in terms of pH distribution. Other variables include land surface elevation, clay content, local screen intervals, and I highlighted here in bold 2 different variables that came out of a previous boosted regression tree model estimating age predictor variables. And so mean age fraction of the young water in the system, water that's less than 65 years old, and the mean length of groundwater flow path were important variables in this pH model, interestingly. So another important water quality predictor variable that was generated from a boosted regression tree model is the redox model, and the model was developed to predict redox conditions using the likelihood of low DO or high iron as indicators of anoxic conditions. So again, the data came from all of those data sources I talked about, and we're focusing on thresholds that describe anoxic conditions. Anoxic conditions influence geogenic contaminant mobilization, and oxic conditions limit denitrification potential, so we're interested in redox. If we look at the top map, again, we can slice and dice at any depth. This time, the author sliced at the 20% saturated thickness in the map at the top and at the 80% thickness at the map at the bottom. And we can see as we go deeper in the aquifer, the area that contains anoxic groundwater is larger. We also can see areas, large areas, where anoxic conditions exist, and so we might see high trace element concentrations. And where we see oxic water in green, those are areas where if there are nitrate sources, that nitrate's likely to persist in the groundwater, maybe all the way till it discharges to a surface water body. And the last model I want to talk about is a model that was used to generate information on groundwater age in 3 dimensions. The process is the same as what we saw before. The difference, however, is that the response variable was generated using numerical models. So looking at the steps here, numerical simulation models were constructed for a range of HUC 8 watersheds across the aquifer system using an automatic process. These are really inexpensive models. Notebooks that describe their construction can be accessed through this URL on the slide. Then particle tracking was done to create residence time distributions within those modeled areas, and age metrics were extracted from those distributions, and those age metrics, such as the fraction of young water was one of the metrics, then is used as a response variable. And I think there were 5 different metrics, and so there were 5 age-related models. The boosted regression tree models were trained on these age metrics using spatially continuous data, same thing as what was done before. There was a little bit of calibration of the numerical models, and in fact, tritium concentrations were simulated where we had tritium data, and we tried to, or Jeff tried to match that, and there were also some other calibration parameters. So as I mentioned, there were a number of metrics that served as response variables. That was fraction of young water extracted from the numerical modeling, mean travel time of young water, median travel time of old fraction of water, mean path length. And so what you see on the right are the results of some of this modeling. At the top, we see the fraction of young water. We can see in the Northeast and in south of the Great Lakes, and kind of in the center there, we have younger water than we do in Michigan, the Glove, or out west where we had arid conditions. And at the bottom, we see not the fraction, but the actual mean travel time of that young fraction. So that really brings us to the end of this presentation, and I was really only able to hit the high points of a really tremendous body of work. Links to all the individual publications are on the slides if you want to really get into some more detail. And in summary, I would just say that machine learning models can be used to predict water quality in 3D and hydrogeologically complex aquifer systems at the subcontinental scale, something we wouldn't have thought we could do 10, 15 years ago. Map results can be used to identify areas where elevated concentrations of selected contaminants are likely to occur, but where there's little data available. pH, redox, and groundwater age are important variables for understanding water quality, but can only be used to map water quality if they're available throughout a study area. And 3-dimensional boosted regression tree predictions of pH, groundwater, and variety of groundwater age metrics can be used in subsequent models describing the occurrence and distribution of pH and or redox dependent constituents of concern. Thanks.